There has been a great deal of debate about the possibility that nuclear weapons will be used in the current dispute being played out in Ukraine between Soviet and Ukrainian forces. That really stems from two things. Firstly, the perceived poor performance of Soviet conventional forces in achieving Putin's aims, but also Putin's periodic saber rattling about putting nuclear weapons on high alert and his willingness to use them should the eventuality come. And this has caused a great deal of consternation in the West. The traditional non-use of nuclear weapons has been seen as a way of granting a good housekeeping award, so to speak, to governments since 1945. To hold nuclear weapons is one thing, to use them is another. When it comes to the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago, the Kennedy cabinet was really worried about what they described as an irrational first use by the Soviet Union of nuclear weapons in response to the quarantine that they announced around Cuba. When we are looking at what has happened in the Ukraine over the course of 2022, rationality is not high on the list of things we would ascribe to Putin's leadership. So there is always the possibility. I think the doctrines that have been ascribed to the Soviet Union and for Russia that followed about the use of nuclear weapons always revolves around a critical threat to Russian territory. If you like, that the nature of the Soviet Union and the nature of Russia was being challenged by military forces, and it is only in the last gasp, so to speak, that nuclear weapons will be considered. Well, it then puts you in the position of considering how we look at the Crimea and the eastern Donbass region of Ukraine and those which are claimed by Russia as being their territory now. It becomes problematic if Russia considers territory which is commonly seen to be Ukrainian but under Russian occupation as Russian territory, and the use of nuclear weapons could start there. There's also been a lot of debate about what tactical nuclear weapons might be used, including some discussions about Russian weapons which are small enough to yield only about 10 tons of TNT or high explosives. Now, there have always been very small nuclear weapons. The Americans had the Davy Crockett, which was effectively a nuclear hand grenade. Not quite, but you get the idea. Well, the concept of the usable nuke has really come up in discussions over the past 6 years. And certainly under the Trump administration, the W-76 Mark II warhead only had a yield of 5 to 7 kilotons. Now let's put that in perspective. 7 kilotons is half the yield of the Hiroshima bomb. The Hiroshima bomb killed 70,000 people within the first 24 hours, and in the following 5 years it killed at least another 70,000 people through the effects of radiation on the human body, producing cancers and other destructive diseases. Describe a nuclear weapon as being small or usable at quotes only half unquotes the Hiroshima bomb. There, we need to question that. So what might happen? Well, for NATO to become involved, so it's not purely America, for NATO to become involved, there needs to be a direct threat to NATO territory. And since the United Nations deemed nuclear weapons to be illegal at the beginning of last year, something that went largely unnoticed because none of the major powers signed up to the declaration, there is an argument that the radioactive fallout represents a deliberate poisoning of other territories should it cross borders into Poland, Hungary and other countries that have an alignment with NATO. So there is now a very grey area. For those of you who watched Chernobyl and saw the way that radiation was dispensed from that particular nuclear power station, you will know that there is real issues about containing a nuclear event. Would Russia use nuclear weapons? There is a great deal of discussion about it. It is still highly unlikely. Would NATO retaliate? And I think there is a real problem. If Putin does decide to use very small nuclear weapons and there's no response from America, we are no longer in a world where it is unthinkable to use these weapons of mass destruction. Now, a nuclear weapon at a strategic level is a weapon of diplomacy, and there are enough military thinkers who see them being useless in all circumstances. But there is a possibility that America will destroy stockpiles of nuclear weapons with nuclear weapons to say to Russia, no, stop. Now, if we're lucky, that will be the end of the escalation. It's a slight fallacy to talk about escalating to de-escalate in the context of Russia. The first use of nuclear weapons, okay, or the use of conventional weapons to destroy nuclear power stations and create a Chernobyl-like event in the Ukraine, really cannot be considered as being within the general rules of war. So what would happen if there was a strike on the Soviet Union? What would happen if there was a strike on Russia to take out other similar nuclear weapons, effectively to prevent their use? The doomsday scenario is that escalation leads to the end of the world. Actually, you don't need to go that far. Limited nuclear war, even if it is limited in its scope to Eastern Europe, might create the conditions for a nuclear winter. A nuclear winter is the situation where sufficient particulates are in the upper atmosphere, kicked up from the number of ground or airburst explosions with nuclear weapons, to dull the sunlight as it reaches the Earth. And this is a proposition that came in the early 1980s, about 40 years ago. And in American minds, it's linked particularly with Carl Sagan, the cosmologist. So there has been a trend for smaller nuclear warheads. It was not uncommon to have 5 megaton nuclear warheads on American missiles. The largest that you will find on a Trident missile is just under half a megaton. I mentioned the W6 nuclear warhead that can go onto Trident II missiles. They have a standard yield of 100, the second variant 90 kilotons, and now we have a very small variant with 5 to 7 kilotons. It wouldn't actually take many of those to be detonated. One estimate puts it in the region of less than 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs to change the atmosphere sufficiently that it would be a suicide note for all of humanity. When the American general Curtis LeMay spoke in the 1950s about a preemptive nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, using largely bomber technology at the time, and possibly raining down hundreds of nuclear warheads to destroy the Soviet Union before it was a potential threat to America to do the same, he was actually proposing global suicide. LeMay was actually the head of the United States Air Force at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the issue which comes from such a destructive act would have been the environmental catastrophe which would have followed and the cooling of the Earth. A nuclear winter will be ceding the amount of sunlight that comes through to the point where everything dies. Eventually, It wouldn't be an immediate process, but we're talking about crops dying from the lack of sun and effectively nothing to feed on for mammals like us. We're not looking at an apocalyptic exchange of nuclear weapons. A sufficiently large exchange of small weapons in a limited area might have the same devastating effect as was foretold 40 years ago with the nuclear winter. Now, America can think about a certain degree of impunity with their missile defense system. That, rather like Star Wars in the 1980s, has not reached a point of being proven to be effective or any practical defense against the mass of the American population as it stands now. So the bottom line on this is nobody wins with a nuclear war. The concern, more than anything, about the war in Ukraine at present is the short term is all that the current president of Russia is thinking of, and the lives of our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren will not be something for him to worry about. A destruction of the planet to win a war that he foretold would be successful for the Russians might be a price he is prepared to pay.